Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gent, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Removing the Frontier, Iowa Statehood and the Long History of Native European Interactions. The Ames Public Library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. I think this really fits that bill. Thank you, Sebastian. We welcome program proposals, so please contact me or any of our staff if you have an idea to explore with us. After the presentation, we're going to open the conversation for questions to not only the live audience, but invite our at-home audience to unmute themselves. Maybe not all at once, we'll see how that goes. But if for any reason, if someone at home would like us to ask their question on their behalf, just put it in chat. So back to tonight's program. Sebastian Braun became Director of American Indian Studies at Iowa State University in 2015. He was previously chair of the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of North Dakota. After advanced studies in ethnology, history, and philosophy at the University of Basel, close in Switzerland, I looked it up. Google. Sebastian earned an MA and PhD in anthropology from Indiana University, which I know where that is. Among other publications, Braun is the author of Buffalo Inc., American Indians and Economic Development, and editor of Transforming Ethnohistories, Narrative, Meaning, and Community. He's been writing for the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs since 2004 and is a co-founder of the American Indian Studies Great Plains Consortium. His current interests lie in the impacts of the Bakken oil boom and the comparative analysis of natural resource extraction in rural communities, which I would like to learn more about. So without further ado, we'll get started with tonight's program. Thanks.
All right, thank you. The book and stuff is another presentation, I think, or maybe several. I don't know. So I'm Sebastian, and as my students know, I like to walk around, so I'm not going to just stand here because I need to walk it off. And so what I want to do today is, so Susan asked me to do something on Native peoples and Iowa because last year was the 175th anniversary of state founding, 1846. And as is not uncommon, I think, so because of the pandemic, there was not that much, but oftentimes indigenous peoples are forgotten in those kinds of events and commemorations. So we thought we would do something on the interactions between Native peoples and Iowa. And so what I'm going to do, just to be just open from the front, is I'm going to give you like a very quick overview of things, and then with large holes in it, and then hopefully we will have time for a lot of questions and can get to the points that you want to discuss. Okay. Why doesn't it? Oh, down. No. No. I do need a clicker.
Well, let's just stop for a second.
Okay.
And make sure. Hello, everyone.
There you go. Thank you. All right. So where we can start is with the seal of the Great Seal of the State of Iowa. I'm always fascinated by these seals because the images that they show, are supposed to indicate the state and the state's history. And so, as you can see on the Great Seal of the State of Iowa, and this resembles actually a lot of the seals of the states around us, especially Nebraska, Kansas, and so on. There are no Native people, right? And in Minnesota, at least, there's like a Native person that rides into the sunset. and in some other states too. But in Iowa, for Iowa, there's no trace of any native people. And when I came here in 2015, I noticed that we didn't have a class on native peoples in Iowa either at the university. So I'm teaching now a class on native peoples in Iowa. And when I ask my students, what do you know about native peoples in Iowa? What do you know about American Indians in Iowa? They usually know nothing. Some people know effigy mounds. Some people know, that there's a tribe called Black Hawk. People say sometimes, things like that. But really, there's like not much that people know. And what part of what I want to discuss tonight is why this is like why have people been literally removed from this area, right? And therefore, like we have this idea of the frontier moving, east to west, usually across the United States. And so I call the talk "Removing the Frontier" because it's not just that the frontier moved, but also that it removed people. And we will get to the present, and what we can see is how these interactions go from the historic times to the present. Okay, let's start at the beginning. As I said, this is going to be like large holes. Okay, but at the beginning, this is what Iowa, looked like when there was still well, the glacier is gone, but the Des Moines lobe is still here. So this used to be a glacier, right? This used to be a glacier where you were underneath it, and so but from about 13,000 years ago or so, we know that there were people in Iowa, and not just in one or two locations, but there were people all across Iowa, right? So prehistorically, we know that all of Iowa was settled. We also know that these people from about 5,000 years on were agricultural. That is, they had domesticated plants, they planted those plants, they harvested them, and that was a big part of their diet, right? Plants, by the way, that were locally or regionally domesticated. So that's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that before corn came from Mesoamerica, around here about 1000 AD or so, before that, people were already agricultural and were planting domesticated plants that today in their wild form we think are weeds and we rip out of our yards because they don't belong. But people in the Midwest had actually increased, for example, grain sizes, 1,000%, so that they could actually harvest these plants and use them as subsistence foods. Right? So this idea that native peoples were, hunters and gatherers living in small isolated groups and following the buffalo, as some of my students put it sometimes, it's a huge stereotype, and as all stereotypes, there's kernels of truth in it, but it doesn't apply to most people in Iowa who lived in, prehistorically also, lived in settlements, permanent settlements, palisades, oftentimes not in teepees, but in lodges and houses, who had gardens, at least, if not fields, who maybe seasonally hunted buffalo, but definitely not all year round. So. Okay, that was my prehistoric thing. Okay, so what I really want to get into is Europeans coming, right? And the first Europeans who came to Iowa then were the French. And this is an extract from a French map from 1684. So this is very early, we think, right? Because most people think that Lewis and Clark were the first ones who explored here. And so this is 120 years before that. And what you can see on the map is that on most of these maps, the map makers, sorry, I'm not supposed to walk through so too far. The map makers put the people and their villages onto the map, right? So what we have here is the Mississippi River that goes up here, and then we have the Missouri that kind of goes up here. And this map maker didn't know which one was the longest river, so it's not quite clear which one is the Missouri, right? But this definitely is the Kansas, right? And then over here you have Santa Fe, and this is Spain, right? So this is the boundary line between France and Spain on European maps, not from indigenous perspectives, because very much these people were sovereign nations. But what you have here is Iowa, right? Right here, at the center of it, that's Iowa, and you can see the villages that are put on, and up there, I don't know if you can, sorry, I can't jump like kind of anymore. You have the first river from the top that goes to the left. That's the Rivière des Iowa, right? And then there's a town up there, and it says Iowa, right? And that's the Iowa, right? And that's the Iowa River, and that's what the state is named after, right? So it's not an accident that this state is called Iowa. The state is called after a native nation that used to live across most of what today is Iowa. Here's a map from 1718, and you can see how much better this map is. It's a quantum leap, basically. And so you have the Mississippi again, and now you actually have the Missouri River that goes, all the way into the Dakotas, because the French people by 1718 had been up there in the Dakotas, and they knew the river quite well. And you have you have the villages. And so what you also have is right there, kind of like top center of the map, you have this line that goes across from the Mississippi to basically the Missouri. And it says chemin des voyageurs, that is the path of the voyageurs, path of the traders. And so that is where the French traders who came across the Great Lakes, and then kind of like from, across Illinois, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, that's how they got from the Mississippi then to basically the Big Sioux River. And what you can see over there on the Big Sioux, again, you have villages there, and one says Maha, that's the Omaha. Okay. And then the other one says Iowa, and that obviously is the Iowa. And then you can also see there's another village of the Iowa that's a little further west, right? And then here you have the Oktotuta, these are the Oto. Here you have the Kansas. And it's very accurate in terms of like, the French obviously knew all these people. They had contacts with them, they traded with them. There was a lot of interaction with these native people. Over here on the Mississippi, you have the mine de plomb, those are the lead mines. Duluth was founded as on the site of these lead mines very early on. Okay, and I just wanted to say something about Des Moines, because like Iowa, Des Moines is actually named after a tribe, and it's not, like, I know there's at least there used to be T-shirts in the airport that said Des Moines French for like monks or something. No, it has nothing to do with monks. Okay, there was not a monastery somewhere in Des Moines. That's not true. I mean, so Des Moines is really named after the river, because the rivers were the most important features, and the river was the Moingena Rivière, right? So the river of the Moingena. And when the British and then British traders came, and then when the Americans took over, that became simply the river Des Moines, right? Because Moingena was too long, and so we shortened that to Moines, and then it's Des Moines, and so now we have Des Moines as a name for the city. But also we have, of course, Des Moines County, which is somewhere completely different, but still on the Des Moines River, right? And so that makes perfect sense once you know that history, That is, the history, the name has nothing to do with a specific place. It has to do with the river, right? And the river is named after the people who lived at the confluence of the river with the Mississippi, because that's where the French came down and encountered these people. So you have a lot of names in Iowa that are native inspired. Some of them have actually something to do with people who lived here. Some of them have absolutely nothing to do with people who lived here, like Pocahontas or Cherokee, or things like that, right? So it might be, sometimes it's a little difficult to interpret that, but obviously there are some places where the history is actually in the place, right? And now, of course, we have Iowa Creek here, which is named after obviously the Iowa tribe too. Okay, all right. So when the Americans came, right, the question is always, so how did this work? How did then people take over this land, right? How did the Americans take over this land? Because the French couldn't take over the land. They were way too weak. There were not many French people here. There were a few traders that lived with native people according to native cultures, and they had to assimilate into native cultures, right? And they definitely did not buy any land from native people. So the Americans came, and this is what happened. Every inch of Iowa is subject to a treaty, right? And so this is a map of the treaties that affect Iowa with the year of the signings of those treaties. And treaties are law, right? According to the Constitution of the United States, treaties are the law of the land. And so really what we have to understand is two things, right? One is that it doesn't matter when a treaty was signed, it is still law, right? It's not like just a document that somebody signed in 1842, and that's a long time ago. So, we don't have to pay attention to that anymore. It is still the law. And so that's really important. If you break a treaty, then you break the law, right? And the other thing is that, as you can see, everybody who lives in the state of Iowa today lives on treaty territory. That is, everybody who lives in the state of Iowa is subject to a treaty. And that's not just native people. A treaty has two parties, right? That is everybody who lives on the land, right? And I always tell my students, you can see that actually, because in Iowa, we have these land books when you buy property, and the first entry in the land book should be whoever bought the land from the United States. And the United States had the land because it bought it in a treaty, right? So every inch of Iowa is covered by a treaty. Now, why would native people sign away all this land? Why would they sell all this land, right? And that's a different question. And the reason is, sorry, I'll go back to that. The reason is that these, and sorry, you don't have to read all of that, it's from me. The reason is that these treaties were offers that couldn't be refused. If you watch The Godfather, right, how does The Godfather make people do what they want to do, right? They make an offer that cannot be refused, and that's exactly what the United States did. The United States had this planned out. So this is Thomas Jefferson, who was president back then in 1803, who wrote to William Henry Harrison, who was then governor of the territory of Indiana and would later then also become president. And so this is Jefferson laying out the plan of how the United States will acquire the land in the future. And it is very simple. The plan is that the United States will open stores, will engage in basically most of the fur trade, and therefore then the native people will incur debts, right? And once those debts have been accumulated to the degree that they couldn't be paid back, then the United States will go and will say, we will be happy to to pay your debts, right? But you have to give us the land. And Jefferson makes very clear that he doesn't want war, right? War is expensive. War is can be unpopular. War has casualties. So if there's a better way to do this without conflict, without armed conflict, that's great. This is the way we will have people incur debt and then pay them off for them if they give us the land. And this is exactly how most of these treaties, and if not all of them, came to pass. The United States comes and says, we're going to pay your debts, but you sell us the land, right? In fact, this treaty in the middle here, which is central Iowa, right, where Ames is, right, that treaty actually was made because the Sac and Fox, who by then governed this land, had taken it over from the Iowa, came to the United States. So in 1841, the United States came to Sac and Fox and said, hey, we would like to sign a treaty and sell us this land. And the Sac and Fox said, no, we don't want to sell it. And by 1842, the Sac and Fox went to the United States and said, we would like to sell some land, right? The United States said, okay, you're going to sell us all of it. And the Sac and Fox said, no, we don't want to sell you all of it. We don't want to sell all of our land. And the United States said, well, it's either all or nothing. And they couldn't, by that time, they just couldn't negotiate anymore. They were in a position from which they could no longer negotiate, right? So this is the Treaty of 1842, and there's this red line that goes down the middle, right, almost. So the Treaty of 1842 said that Sac and Fox had to remove themselves from this part by 1842, end of 1842, and then from this part by the end of 1845. And this is why the state of Iowa is founded in 1846, because in 1846, then this part of Iowa was now open for settlement, right? So it's not a coincidence that 1846 is the year that Iowa was founded. The treaty had to happen first. So the Sac and Fox and sell all their land, where do they go, right? And these treaties in Iowa are treaties of removal. Removal was the official policy of the United States between 1800 and 1865, the end of the Civil War, basically, maybe a little later. And what you can see here is Iowa, right? This is from about 1840, the map. You can see Iowa, central Iowa, still Iowa, Sac and Fox is still there. The Potawatomi to the left originally come from Illinois. They have been removed to Iowa and will then be removed from Iowa further west and then south into what is called Indian Territory. And this means, all these treaties of removal means that Iowa was theoretically free of native peoples, right? They had all been removed. And you can see, this is from 1850, a notice in a newspaper, of course, not everybody removed. Some native people stayed behind. Some native people came seasonally to harvest, to come back to their lands, to come back to their sites. But at least theoretically, they now were all removed from Iowa. And you can see how the frontier, the frontier, right, is something very abstract. But on this map, you can actually see how the frontier came to Iowa from the Mississippi River. These counties are already organized here. What is left is, this obviously it's from 1842 or 1843 or something like that. What is left to be settled is the western half of the Treaty of 1842, right, where people were waiting for native peoples to remove themselves by the end of 1845, so that they could settle those lands too. Obviously, people came back, right? And what most people know about Native people in Iowa is Mesquaki Settlement, right? So the Mesquaki came back because the state of Iowa not only allowed them to come back, but actually actively supported them in buying lands in Iowa, which is amazing. Okay, if you put that into historical context, it's truly an amazing event that a state would not only allow Native people to come back and settle in that state from where they had been removed, like only like 12 years before, but also actively help them because the Mesquaki couldn't buy land in Iowa because they had been removed. And so the state actually then had to buy the land in trust for them, right? And so you can see this is a map of the settlement. The green block there is the original 80 acres that the Mesquaki bought originally. And then you can see how the land base has grown since then, as the Mesquaki spent basically all of their allotment money, or their treaty annuity money, to buy more land to expand the settlement. Right. The settlement today, by the way, has the official status of a reservation, and I know it's still the Mesquaki Settlement, but the status is the same as any other reservation. After a while, the state of Iowa decided that it could no longer support the Mesquaki. While the state had bought the land for the Mesquaki in trust for them, with Mesquaki money, but in trust for the Mesquaki, the federal government could not implement their assimilation policies onto the Mesquaki. So when the federal government came and said, we will allot your land, that is, we will make it privately owned, the Mesquaki said, no, you have nothing to say here. The state of Iowa said, how come the federal government comes and says Iowa landowners what to do with their land? You can't do that, right? When the federal government came and said, you know, all of you need to go to a government school, your children have to be enrolled in a government school, the Mesquaki said, no, we don't, because you have nothing to say here. And so for a long time, until the end of the 19th century, the Mesquaki Nation actually had the opportunity to stay very, very traditional, right? This changed in some ways. Not that the Mesquaki were no longer traditional, but it changed because the pressures changed, because the state of Iowa at the end of the 19th century decided that the Mesquaki should be assimilated, and basically gave up this very, very benevolent stance, if you want, towards the Mesquaki nation in terms of their cultural, continuity, and transferred the lands, the trust holdings of the lands, to the United States. And so then the United States came in and did what they did everywhere else. So, for example, this is the Indian Training School in Toledo, where that was built basically for children of the Mesquaki Nation, although the Mesquaki resisted that as much as they could. And the federal government basically had to bring in Native children from Wisconsin and from Minnesota to fill the school, right? And so the frontier, if you want, right? There's the frontier that removes Native people, right? And then there's this period where the state not invites them, but allows them, actively supports them coming back. And then the attitudes change again, right? Today, the Mesquaki are not the only people in Iowa, not the only Native people who have lands in Iowa, right? So you have, on one hand, you have the Omaha and the Winnebago. So this is the Missouri River, far western Iowa. Here's Onawa, and down here is Omaha. So you have the Omaha, who own these two parcels across the Missouri in Iowa, and the Winnebago, who also own a parcel in Iowa. So both the Winnebago and the Omaha are also tribes in Iowa, right? And there's a fourth tribe who owns lands in Iowa, which is the Ponca. The Ponca tribe owns that parcel right there in Carter Lake, which is the part of Omaha between Omaha and the airport of Omaha that belongs to Iowa. There's a part of Omaha that belongs to Iowa, and the Ponca have lands there. These lands were the fact that the Omaha and the Winnebago own lands in Iowa. It was disputed and had to have a Supreme Court decision in the 1980s. And these lands here are even newer. These lands were turned into trust lands in 2007, don't quote me, please, 2007, 2009, something like that. And they are still subject to an ongoing dispute over whether the Ponca should be allowed to build a casino on these lands, a decision that the state of Iowa has fought for the past decade or so. It's kind of settled now, but it's also kind of not. There's still a lot of resistance. So there are some new disputes, new conflicts that are coming up. And so where I want to end this and give time for a discussion, hopefully, is just to reiterate, right, that there are these four tribes are tribes that are also Iowa tribes. And so it's remarkable that, you know, from a history of removal, we have a very rich presence of Native peoples, obviously not just of members of those tribes, but of members of any tribe today in Iowa. But these four tribes are also tribes that are in Iowa, and they're basically Iowa tribes, if you want. You can see that the Omaha have renamed themselves and they're now the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, for example, right? Just to make this very clear that they have a presence in the state. Right? Okay, so that was my very quick run through, and I hope that we can discuss some of the points in this whole history that I have run over and left out. But I don't like to just speak to people with what I like to talk about. I'd be really more than happy to talk about anything having to do with Native people and Iowa, anything that comes to mind. Okay, so.
We have a mic. Do you mind coming up, or I could bring it to you? It's just better for the people at home to hear.
Do you know more about how land ownership works? I mean, do the Mesquaki actually own more land that maybe is not part of the federal reservation system?
Okay.
Maybe explain all of that a little bit.
Yes, okay, yes, I can. So the Mesquaki, so there are some things that are, sorry, I'm just thinking about where to start. So the Mesquaki own the land in common, right? Before European presence and before European notions of private land ownership, Native nations owned land in common. Right? This is not actually, it's not a foreign concept for Europeans, because in a lot of European societies, people owned land in commons, right? If you go to Massachusetts, there's commons in every village, right? I don't know if they're still owned in commons. There's commons, right? It's not a foreign notion. And so the land that was owned as a territory by Native nations was their territory that they owned in common, but they didn't have private ownership of individual parcels. Right? In the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, especially, the United States, the federal government decided that Native people should own land as private parcels, and initiated this process called allotment. Okay. That is, they took the in commonly owned territory of a nation, by that time a reservation, and divided up into parcels that they then allotted to individual owners. Okay. But it didn't do so everywhere. Okay. And one place where they didn't do so was the Mesquaki Nation, and they couldn't do so at Mesquaki, on the Mesquaki Settlement, because they didn't have the land, right? Because the state of Iowa held the land in trust. So the Mesquaki Settlement, until today, is owned in common. Every single piece of land on the Mesquaki Settlement is owned by the nation, right? In common. So that's very kind of unique. There are other nations, there are other indigenous nations, tribes, where that is still true. Red Lake in Minnesota, for example, Menominee in Wisconsin, there's others, right? But it's not very common. So Native nations or tribes, as we say, can incorporate. Okay. And that is, they can form a corporation, and as a corporation, they can, of course, buy whatever land they want, wherever they want, right? Just like any other corporation. However, and this is where we get into really gray areas a lot of times. As a corporation, then, the land, so if a native tribe buys, or a native individual buys land in Ames, right? That land is owned in the same way as any other land in Ames. Okay. If I have an allotment, okay, then that is usually trust land, so-called trust land. And trust land is land that a native person or a native tribe owns, but that the federal government holds the title in trust for them. Okay, and if I don't have the title, I cannot sell it, I cannot lease it, I cannot improve it without permission, right? And so in order to do anything with that land, I need to get the permission from the federal government, right? On the other hand, because the federal government holds the title in trust, I also don't necessarily pay property taxes to the state on that land, right? Because there's the federal government, there's the state, and so taxes go that way, but not this way, right? And so this is where this idea comes from that Native people don't pay taxes, right? And it's, you know, I hear that all the time. Maybe not in Iowa, but in South Dakota, it's very common. Native people don't pay taxes, property taxes, not because they're Native. Native people don't pay property taxes on trust land because it is trust land. It is because the federal government holds title and trust for them. Right? And this is really important to understand. So I don't know, sorry, that was a long way around. I don't know if the Mesquaki as a tribe own other lands, but those are the trust lands. It is, those are the lands where they have full sovereignty over, right? And where you know, the tribe owns that land, but the federal government holds it in trust for them. Does that make sense? It's, sorry. Okay.
So we have one in chat on Zoom. The 4 other tribes, how many individuals make up those groups, and what are they doing with their land, farming or other activities? And also, what is the population of Mesquaki Settlement?
Okay. I don't know. Sorry. I know I should, but a few thousand people. And you know, it's really hard to, I'm sure the Mesquaki Nation has numbers up somewhere. And maybe I should have looked it up before I came here. But it's hard to know how many people exactly live on Mesquaki Nation, because of course, Mesquaki people don't only live on the settlement, right? Mesquaki people live everywhere. I mean, in Ames, in Marshalltown, in Iowa City, in New York, in, I don't know, Norway, probably, you know, just like everybody else, right? And so there's a constant flux. And so there's a difference, obviously, between the membership of the Mesquaki Nation and the people who live on the settlement. And I'm sorry to say, but I don't know either one by heart. I would say a few thousand. It's my guess. And most of these nations, the Ponca are the smallest one. The Ponca are the smallest nation of those four. The Omaha and the Winnebago and the Mesquaki are probably, my guess, about equal numbers, a few thousand members in each nation.
I'm gonna turn up the lights. I don't want to surprise you.
Do you know how the profits from the Mesquaki casino are divided among the tribe? Do they go to schools? Do they go to individuals?
So as far as, I don't want to say anything wrong. Let me say something in general about casinos, okay, before I get there. So casino profits are always an issue, or people want to know about. So the first thing about casino profits of native casinos is that native casinos are enterprises of sovereign nations, and they have no responsibility to make those figures public, and most of them don't. So trust me, I've tried. So there are figures on the overarching, the in general tribal gaming, right? Those numbers are available, and they're about the same as non-tribal gaming in the United States. So if you take all the native casinos in the United States, the profits are in line with the non-native casinos in the United States. In Iowa, there's many more non-native casinos than native casinos. I think there are 3 native casinos, Mesquaki, and then the Winnebago and the Omaha both have casinos on their tribal lands in Iowa too, largely because Interstate 29 is on the Iowa side of the border, and it's far more accessible, right? There are huge differences between native casinos. The top 15% or so of native casinos in terms of revenue make about 70% of the total revenue of native casinos, and the lower like 50%, almost 50%, make about 7% of the revenues, right? So there are tribes that have casinos that make a ton of money, okay, without a doubt. Most tribal casinos do not make a ton of money because in general, you need about 500,000 to 1 million people within an hour's driving distance to have a casino that actually creates those profits that you might be looking for. And that's just not the case, in many places. If you have a casino, obviously, downtown Chicago, if somebody would have a casino downtown Chicago, right? If you have a casino halfway between Boston and New York, that's pretty good. If you have a casino right outside of San Diego or LA or San Francisco, that's great. But if you have a casino somewhere in Montana or North Dakota, that's just not in the cards, right? And obviously the Mesquaki, if people in Des Moines have the choice going to Altoona or to, does Altoona have a casino? I think so, right? Or to Mesquaki, right? You have to really work at getting them driving to Mesquaki. So you have to make a destination, right? So I would say the Mesquaki Nation Casino is not, I have been to casinos that are a lot less profitable. And there are casinos that are a lot more profitable. but I do not know the numbers. Okay, like nobody should know the numbers. Okay, the profits from casinos. There's two ways that tribes divvy up the profits. One is you have per capita payments, and the other one is that the tribe takes the profit. So a lot of tribes actually take profits and subsidize government programs. So tribes have the opportunity today to make contracts with the federal government, for example, to manage schools or to manage police departments or to manage health clinics or things like that. And so a lot of tribes take the profits that they have from casinos, and then, instead of the IHS clinic being open Monday through Friday, 8 to 4, you can then afford for it to be open like 7 days a week, things like that. Or you have housing. Housing is a huge problem on most reservations. You can support housing programs, things like that. And then there are tribes who do per capita payment. But even if you have per capita payments, doesn't mean that necessarily everybody's rich, right? So there are tribes that have per capita payments where people get a check and they don't have to work. That's just the way it is. And there are tribes where you get per capita payments $80 a year, right? So again, a huge difference, right? I have no idea. I will deny any knowledge of how the Mesquaki Nation divvies up its casino money. We will not talk about that. Right. Or the Omaha or the Winnebago. That's just.
Okay,
Yeah.
I know this is a very broad question,
Yeah.
but you mentioned that because of, European and American colonialism, we essentially pushed all of these people out, and some came back, but a lot didn't. Can you briefly talk about, the cultural effects and just like the general effects of that dispossession that occurred?
Sure. So let's imagine that you are. I take this from Lance Foster, who wrote a great book, if you're interested in any of these things, Indians of Iowa. It's like a short book and gives just an overview of everything. Let's imagine that you are 10 years old in 1804, when Lewis and Clark come through. You would live as a native person here. You would live in a society that is absolutely sovereign, that has its territory, that has its neighbors who are also sovereign, that have dealt with non-native people for a long time, where you might have relatives who have fought in their wars, you trade with them and so on. That's 1804. 40 years later, so now you're 50, you now live in a society that has been removed from all its lands and is de facto absolutely dependent on the federal government in terms of food, in terms of housing, in terms of everything. And this same federal government has told you, right, that your language, your religion, your political system, your economic system, your ways of achieving status in society, the way you run your society is now absolutely irrelevant because it's wrong and is very much pushing you to replace all of that with its own cultural values and systems. So what happens when something like that happens, right? We know what happens because I always say, if you want to know what happens, go ask somebody who's an elder in your society and say, when you grew up, were things worse or were they better? And most people who are older would say they were much better. And the reason for that is that because we grow up and we grow up and we learn cultural values, right, as we grow up. And then we live, and if we are lucky enough to live long enough, then some things change. And we're not quite familiar with those things anymore, right? The values change slightly, the practices change, the society changes, and so on. And so this happens, if we are lucky, this happens so slowly that, when we are old, whatever that means, right? We still recognize our society as our society. Most of it is still recognizable. Most of it we can still agree with, right? If we're very unlucky, though, somebody will come and say, from now on, right, all of those things that you have used to attach meanings to the world, that you have used to make sense of the world, that you have used to orient yourself in the world, they are now gone, right? And that really paralyzes, people, because if you cannot orient yourself in the world anymore, you cannot do anything. And so what happened to the people, we can see a little bit of that, for example, when end of communism, people in those societies, I mean, for a generation, it was just nothing, right? And there are lots of testimonies, from Native people who lived through that, and people went and interviewed them, and it's remarkable because they say, on the plains, for example, people would say, once the buffalo were gone, nothing happened, right? And obviously it's not true that nothing happened, but for them, they couldn't make sense of what happened anymore. And so nothing happened, right? And if nothing happens, then you are paralyzed. And so what we see really at this stage after removal is that these societies are lost, right? They need time. You need time to rebuild culture as a system that you can apply, you need to find ways in which you can deal with what is going on. And that takes, a generation, 2 generations, sometimes more. And if then removal is just the beginning, then you have allotment, then you have an education system that is continuously imposed on you, then you have a constant economic underdevelopment, things like that, then that is prolonged, right? And I think what we see today, maybe since the 1970s, 60s, is that Native societies as a whole, there were always really strong individuals who were strong enough to carry that, right? And to resist and to keep going, right? But you need to be really strong to do that, right? But we see, I think, that these societies as a whole have found new ways to successfully rebuild. And I think what we see today is that this rebuilding process has been very, very successful, especially when you think about where it started, So I don't know if I answered your question. Okay.
We've got another one on Zoom. Did you say the Sac and Fox were pushed from somewhere else before they were in what's now central Iowa, and where were they before? Okay,
so the Sac and Fox, I was talking about Potawatomi, but we can talk about the Sac and Fox because, so the Sac and Fox are interesting, right? Because the Sac and Fox, the Fox part are the Mesquaki. When the French came to know the Mesquaki, they called them the renard, that is the fox, because there was one clan and they thought that everybody belonged to that clan. So it happens a lot, right? People are just called things that they don't call themselves. So the Mesquaki lived in northern Wisconsin when the French first encountered them. And the French decided that French got along with most of the nations in the Midwest, but not the Mesquaki. The French decided that they would wage genocidal war on the Mesquaki. They actually packed up some mortars, went up to northern Wisconsin and lobbed the mortar shells into the Mesquaki villages, and the Mesquaki just had no way to deal with that, you know. And so the Mesquaki went south, tried to take Chicago from the French, and then the French mustered allies, and there was a huge battle, kind of like in the middle of Illinois, went on for a few days, and then the Mesquaki went further west and asked the Iowa basically if they could settle in you know, close or on parts of their territory in eastern Illinois, western Iowa, and that's where they settled at that time. And then they were pushed further west into Iowa by the Americans, but at the same time, the Iowa, whose territory spanned central Iowa, became weakened by constant conflict with the Dakota, who were to the north, and also by epidemics. And so the Iowa became weaker and weaker, and the Sauk and the Mesquaki, two allied nations, basically moved into Iowa territory. The Sac and Fox is an invention by the Americans. The Sac and Fox, the Americans treated them as one nation. It's very clear that the Mesquaki and the Sauk were two different nations that were allied, you know, but it was so much easier for the Americans to deal with one, with one unified construct of a nation than with two, right? So basically from the beginning, the Americans said, no, you're not the Sauk and the Fox, you're the Sac and Fox. Yeah, so that's, yeah. But the Potawatomi came from Illinois. There are other nations that were removed. So, for example, the Delaware or Lenni Lenape, you know, came from Delaware. Were removed, you know, were pushed out into the Ohio River Valley, were pushed out further west in the Ohio River Valley, were pushed out to Oklahoma in the end, where many people ended up. The Kickapoo at some point had just enough of the United States and went to Mexico, and there's still the Kickapoo tribe in Mexico, and then some of them came back, you know, but there are huge distances that these tribes had to cover. And so one other consequence of removal, right, is that if your homeland, right, is, you know, central Iowa, let's say, and you move to Nebraska, you know, it's a different environment. And then you move to Oklahoma, and it's a different environment. And so that's important, not just because you have to kind of like adapt to the soil and the fertility and the water, and, you know, but and no trees, you know, but also because your culture is built around relationships to the environment, relationships with the environment, specific, you know, what we call sacred relationships, and those are centered in specific sites, in specific places. And when you are constantly removed, then you're removed further and further and further from these really important, meaningful, and meaning-giving sites and places. And so you lose, you know, you lose that relationship if you cannot come back and do the things that you need to do with and to and from those places and ceremonies, right? So that's like another thing that happens with these removals.
Talk a little bit more about this Indian training school thing that you mentioned.
Okay.
Did anything positive come out of that at all? Because it sounds to me like if the tribes that were here didn't send their kids to that school, and the school then had to go to surrounding states to bring kids in to train them to be Americanized or however you want to say it. Did anything positive come out of that?
Okay, so So in general, the federal education system for Native peoples was based in part on exactly that premise. So there were different schools in that system. There were day schools on reservations. There were boarding schools on reservations. And then there were boarding schools off reservation. And the boarding schools off reservation is what most people focus on, right? And those boarding schools off reservation were built exactly to do what you just described, that is, to take children and put them somewhere else, that is outside the realm of the influence of their parents and therefore of their culture, right? It's actually, if you try to achieve if your goal is to brainwash somebody out of their culture, right? It's a very successful strategy. You take children because they're in the process of learning culture, right? And you take them away from their culture. You isolate them from their culture for long periods of time, right? And you force feed them a different system of doing things, right? And I mean success, if that is your goal, right? Many very traumatic things came as a consequence of that, obviously, very traumatic things. If you take children away from parents for years, and they were oftentimes not allowed to go home, not even in summer, they were not allowed to communicate with their parents in their native languages, in letters and, things like that. And these mostly these off-reservation boarding schools. On-reservation day schools and boarding schools worked a little different, but these off-reservation boarding schools, that's really where that happened. Was there anything positive happening from that? Not by intention, but yes, unintentionally, yes. So one thing that happened out of this was that those students who survived and graduated, right, now had a network of people, Native people, from different tribes, right, who had all been treated the same way. And so one thing that came out of this is this understanding, this identity of we are all Indians. People call us Indians. People treat us as Indians. It doesn't matter whether you're Makah or Cherokee or Mesquaki or Ojibwe or, it doesn't matter, right? The other thing that came out of this is this network, and people started to be able to talk to each other in English, write to each other, right? And started to organize themselves. So you have, for example, the Society of American Indians, which is founded in 1912, where where formally educated Native people, doctors, lawyers, got together and said, we will get together and we will now use what we were taught to lobby the federal government and lobby the public about and inform them about what is going on in our communities, right? So that was not an intention, right, but it is a consequence that comes out of that, right? And so, yes, in some ways, education is always that, in part, right? I mean, we look around, we have huge discussions today about education, right? And what it's supposed to achieve. And education, I would say, is 50% indoctrination with culture, right? I mean, at least. I mean, yeah, we learn math and reading and writing, but the rest of it is how you behave and how you become a productive member of a society, right? You're very unlucky if your culture is different from that society that's being drilled into you, obviously, right? But that's the goal of formal education. But state organized education is how to make people productive members of society, right? And so a lot of Native leaders also recognized that in order to be successful in this new society that they were pushed into, their children needed some of this formal education, right? They needed to be able to talk with the federal agent. They needed to be able to petition. They needed to be able to file lawsuits. They needed to be able to, do all those things in a good way. And so many Native communities wanted schools. They wanted schools in their communities, right? And they did not want schools where their culture was going to be brainwashed out of their children, but they wanted schools for the education part, right? Unfortunately, in many cases, at that time, one went with the other, because at the same time that all of this happened, right, the truth that people recognized was that Native people were so-called behind, right? So-called primitive, not civilized, right? And in order to get to their full potential as people, they had to become like Americans. And even though they might not have recognized that at the time, people said, well, you might not recognize that this is good for you, but it is. Because I'm in a position where I'm right and you're wrong. And so I'm going to help you, right? I'm going to help you achieve your goals. And it was not meant, many times these things were not meant, to punish people or to even to destroy them. They were meant to help them, but because nobody went and asked people what they actually wanted in terms of help or what they needed in terms of help, they ended up destroying them. Right? I think one of the largest lessons that we can learn from all of this history is that one of the worst things we can do is to say, we know what you need, right? Even if you tell me that you don't, I know what you need. I know what is best for you. And so I will help you by forcing you to do what I want you to do. And later on, you will thank me. Right? And that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
Thank you. One more question.
Yes.
About the Ponca.
Yeah.
They're the smallest.
Yeah.
They don't have a casino.
They do have one.
They do?
They opened it, yes.
Oh.
Yeah, it's open.
Okay, so that's helping them survive and move forward, because I'm assuming even though maybe they're not, hugely successful, like, some tribes in the United States, particularly I can think of the Seminole down in Florida.
Yeah, well,
Sheer numbers of people. So
a lot of tribes are very successful, even though we don't know them. So, the Seminoles, right? We know maybe because they own Hard Rock Cafe.
yeah,
right?
Right.
But a lot of tribes have diversified and own companies. Wrangler is owned by a tribe.
Oh, cool.
Tribes own horse tracks. Tribes own WNBA teams. Tribes own, whatever is the thing, right? Whatever you can own as a corporation, a tribe can own and run and manage, right? And so you have, and the other thing that is important to mention maybe is that tribes who are very successful, right, have now also gotten into giving loans and grants to other tribes who are maybe less successful. So there is this sense of relationship and obligation and I express it, don't want to say spreading the wealth, because that's not what it's about. It's about having these relationships and making good on them, right? And so that's also what's going on. Yeah.
We have one more question
Yeah.
from back here. Someone's wondering if you can talk a little about the American citizenship status of tribe members.
Sure. So since 1924, all American Indians are American citizens if you're born within the United States. Before that, before 1924, you were not automatically an American citizen, even though you were born within the territorial limits of that United States claims. However, 2/3, I think, of American Indians at the time in 1924 were already citizens, because when you went through allotment, for example, and you received your land in fee, not in trust, but in fee after a period of years, you also gained citizenship because now you were a taxpayer, right? And also because a lot of Native people had served in the armed forces of the United States. And so, but since 1924, all Native peoples in the United States are American citizens, and also members or citizens of their own nations. So they're expressly double citizens, which is not something the United States usually allows. But American Indians, if you are officially American Indian, you are both an American citizen and also a member of your tribe. So, yeah. Don't be shy. I'm still here, it's fine.
Couple more questions. Totally two opposite ends of the spectrum. I'm curious more about the agriculture systems that they had.
Yeah.
If you know about what they were growing and how all that worked, I'm just trying to envision that. And then the other one is totally not really about Iowa, about the Oklahoma case that from a few years ago that determined that.
Last year, 2 years.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. So, all right. Let's start with agriculture. So, people in the Midwest started domesticating pumpkins, gourds, actually first, about 5,000 years ago. Then sunflowers, pumpkins, squash, things like that. And then they domesticated things like little barley, maygrass, sumpweed, things like that. As I said, right, in the name is usually weed somewhere. But they, as I said, once they domesticated it, they used it as a subsistence crop, and it's very successful. So they had this this local or regional agricultural complex of domesticated plants for about, I'd say at least 2,000 years, 3,000 years in most places in the Midwest. It was then replaced by corn, and in many places by what we call the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, right? But not in all places, but corn was the big one. And it's interesting because, you would say, well, of course people plant corn, right? Corn feeds them. But what is interesting about the transition is that corn does not seem to come in as a subsistence crop. That is, in some places, corn is planted as kind of like a side, as a hobby, almost like in small quantities for long years, for generations, like just on the side. And then it takes over. So it's not like, what that tells me is that the plants that they had were actually just as good as corn, right? Because otherwise corn would have taken over, right? Immediately. So they were just as good as corn. And one theory is that they planted corn as a religious act in some ways. Either use it in ceremonies or it was a ceremony itself. We know that with tobacco, some tribes planted tobacco and threw most of it away and kept the seeds to replant. That's the only thing that they kept. And so the act of planting tobacco was in itself the purpose of planting tobacco, right? Because it was a religious act, right? And the other thing is that actually we kind of know when corn takes over as a subsistence crop, because you can tell that people become malnourished. Because if you only eat corn, which makes me think that all that corn syrup, but I'm not going to go there. Okay, Okay, so Oklahoma, if you might. So Oklahoma, the McGirt decision. 2 years ago, I think. So there was another court case, and Oklahoma. What you need to know is when Oklahoma became. So let me back up. Oklahoma used to be Indian territory, and Indian territory was this consequence really of removal. That is, the idea really was that we remove all native peoples to Indian territory where they can live out their existence or assimilate, right? And so Indian territory was there in the middle of the United States. And then people said, well, why do we have Indian territory in the middle of the United States? You know, this is good land, we can use it for ranching and blah, right? So the western half of Indian territory became Oklahoma territory. And it usually was done through allotment. That is, these tribes were all allotted and they had small populations, but large land bases. And since in allotment, I only need as much land as there are people, the rest of the land I can open for settlement. And at that time, the reservations in Western Oklahoma were dissolved, maybe, okay. And then when Indian territory became part of Oklahoma, and there was a lot of discussion at the time because the discussion was, should it become its own state? You know, Sequoia, should it become the state of Sequoia? But it was decided that no, it would become part of Oklahoma, this new state of Oklahoma, 1908, I think was that. And at that time, all these territories were also allotted. Okay. And then the state of Oklahoma said, there are no more reservations in Oklahoma except Osage. The Osage Reservation was clear it was a reservation. And you can look at all the textbooks, okay, because the new ones are not out yet. And it says, you know, the only reservation in Oklahoma is the Osage Reservation. Okay. So the case was that there was a man who was condemned to death by the state of Oklahoma for a crime that he committed. And he said, that crime, I'm native. The victim of the crime was native, and it happened on Indian land. Okay. So the state of Oklahoma has no jurisdiction over this case because there's very clear, or actually very unclear, but clear enough distinctions about jurisdiction in Indian country. And so the question then became, the crime was clear. I think he murdered somebody. It was clear that he was native. It was clear that his victim had been native, right? The only question was this Indian land? Okay. And the Supreme Court at that point deferred because didn't have 9 justices, it was 4-4, you know, and they deferred because there was another case where another man who had also been condemned by the state of Oklahoma argued the exact same thing. And the Supreme Court then had 9 members, and they said, okay, we're going to take this case, we're going to wrap the other one because the question is the same, is this still Indian land? And specifically it was the Creek or Mesquaki lands. The Supreme Court in McGirt versus Oklahoma decided that the Creek or Mesquaki reservation was never disestablished and so still exists. And if the Creek or Mesquaki reservation still exists, then so does the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Seminole and the Quapaw. And those are all the reservations that until now have been have judicial reviews that say, yes, you still exist as a reservation. Okay. Now, what does that mean? So far, it means that if you are a native person committing a crime against another native person on a reservation, the state has no jurisdiction, the federal government has jurisdiction. So with these cases, what happens is that the state sentence is thrown out, and there's a retrial in federal court. And McGirt has been resentenced to, just in federal court, right? Right now, what's going on is that the state of Oklahoma is asking the Supreme Court to reconsider this decision. That is, the state of Oklahoma, and right now has a case up for review by the Supreme Court. Is on, I don't know if the Supreme Court already hasn't made a decision whether to hear it. It has thrown some of the cases out, but I'm not sure if, it's a day-to-day basis right now, really. The state of Oklahoma says, this has wreaked havoc on our state, and it has wreaked havoc on the native people in the state because they don't get any justice, because the federal government is not capable of trying so many cases, and federal courts are not, geared up to do this, and tribal courts are not geared up to do this, and so on. But really, what it's about is sovereignty, right? Because if all these reservations still exist, then the tribes have some form of sovereignty, even over non-trust land on reservations. So, for example, Omaha tribe, there was the same question. The western part of the Omaha reservation had been allotted. It's no trust land. It's basically non-native owned. And there's a city called Pender there. And the Omaha tribe said, you need to pay alcohol sales taxes to the tribe because they have the right to regulate the well-being of tribal citizens in the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And the city filed suit and went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has consistently, not quite. Okay, the Supreme Court has, from time to time, consistently decided these cases for the tribes. And so, Tulsa is now within 3 reservations, okay? Other larger cities are now within reservations. Towns, basically all of eastern Oklahoma is now within reservations. And, part of what feeds this whole dynamic is, of course, people have no idea what it means that there's now a reservation. In practice, if you're not native, nothing will change for you.
Get kicked off.
Well, if you live on trust land, yes, but most people don't live on trust land, so 90% of the things will not change at all. It's just right now, it's just for crimes committed by native people against native people on native lands, that things will change. And it's just a huge, these cases have been decided before. It's just a huge case because it's Oklahoma and it's not the middle of North Dakota or the middle of Nebraska. You know what I mean? Like there are people living there who have a voice, right? And they make their voice heard. And so it's a good case to remind us, right? Then I said that all of Iowa is treaty territory. This means that according to these treaties, tribes have certain rights. Here, tribes have rights by law, by a matter of law, right? And we too often forget that. And we too often say, well, yeah, the next reservation is, over there, so whatever, Well, no, maybe not, whatever. Tribes have rights over water. Tribes have rights over jurisdictional rights, maybe. Tribes have right over natural heritage, cultural heritage sites. Tribes have, presence. And we should acknowledge that presence, because if we ignore it, if non-native people ignore it, it's to their own detriment, because one of these days, tribes will say, sorry you forgot, but no, we're still here, and we still are sovereign and we have rights. So.
Thank you. I think Those were really good questions, tied in a lot of different topics. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all.